Hello, I am Susie Miller, Executive Director for the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, and welcome to the third of three industry expert panels on challenges and opportunities to demonstrating the sustainable production of Canadian grains. Comprised of farmers, input providers, marketers, customers, and environmental organizations, the CRSC is a national industry-led forum developing and showcasing Canada's grain sustainability performance. In this session, we will hear from Tim Fabry, Maple Leaf Foods, and Sav Bellissimo from Federated Co-op. This panel was recorded from a meeting on January 31st, 2022, between the CRSC and grain crop associations. I would like now to turn over the session to our moderator, Kelly Green. Kelly is the chair of the CRSC Communications Committee and Director Communications for the Canadian Canola Growers Association.
So the next part of our session, we are going to have a panel discussion with two very interesting people representing Canada's food industry. We have Tim Fabry from Maple Leaf Foods and Sav Bellissimo from Federated Co-op. And they're going to bring to this discussion a conversation about the what Canada's food companies are seeing from a sustainability standpoint, and tell us a little bit about their perspective. So we will have some open questions at the end. So do make sure if something comes to mind while Tim and Sav are speaking, that you jot those down so you can bring those questions forward at the end. Just a little on the housekeeping duties. We're going to use the same question format. So what we'll do is Tim and Sav are each going to share their perspective for a short while. Then we're going to have some moderated Q&A, and then we'll open the floor for everyone to ask questions. Please use your raise your hand function or post a question in the chat. And we look forward to hearing your questions. We are going to strive to keep on time. So we're going to dive right into it. So I first want to introduce Tim Fabry. Tim is the Vice President. He has a very interesting title, Sustainability and Shared Value with Maple Leaf Foods. So I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit more about that. In Tim's role, he leads the development and execution of the strategy and initiatives that deeply embed sustainability and shared value into Maple Leaf's culture and business. And I'm thinking Tim's going to talk a little bit about some of the focus of Maple Leaf and some of their perspectives on carbon neutral and being a carbon neutral food company. So that's going to be interesting. Sustainability and shared value provide a really important framework for Maple Leaf's purpose, which is to raise the good in food. So I think that's a fairly new tagline for Maple Leaf. Maybe I'm wrong, Tim, but I'm sure you're going to tell us a little bit more about that. So prior to joining Maple Leaf, Tim was the Director of Sustainability and Responsibility at Tim Hortons as well. So, and Tim has a interesting science background. He studied biology at Queen's University, and he also has a Master's of Health Science from the University of Toronto. So Tim, thank you for joining us. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Sure, thanks. And thanks for reaching out and allowing me to be here. I've been listening in on a lot of the conversation thus far, and it's super powerful and really good to hear, because you know, these same conversations are happening all over the world. Like, we are members of large organizations globally, like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the North American Meat Institute, and you know, the global roundtables on poultry, eggs, pork in the US, and dairy farmers. Everyone is having some very similar conversations. So it's nice to see the Roundtable Sustainable Crops leading this, and it's such an important base and framework to get going. And you know, our comments, I think, over the next little Q&A can really kind of pull some of that, the drivers out. So Maple Leaf Foods, I've been with the company now for almost 7 years. when I joined, one of the first roles that I had was to start to really raise the quality and breadth of our sustainability reporting. Why? Because we knew that we were starting to get pressure from investors and shareholders and special interest groups and consumers with respect to our sustainability performance. Remember, Maple Leaf Foods has branded products on shelf. We're a big supplier to food service and retail. And we also, though, have farming operations vertically integrated. So we have a big environmental footprint. We set bold goals back then and are tracking towards them. And in 2017, Kelly, you mentioned our purpose, raise the good in food. That was a fundamental pivot that the company made. That came from almost a decade of transformation from the 2008 listeriosis crisis, where the company invested $1 billion in fixing the business, to now wanting to grow the company after this transformation. And we did a lot of research, particularly around societal issues that impact the food system. And it was pretty telling. We noticed a lot of disconnects out there. Why are there 800 million people on the planet that are undernourished, yet 2 billion people overweight? And why does society throw out 1/3 of their food? Agriculture being pegged with close to 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of big societal issues that the food system is going to need to start addressing. And that's what Raise the Good in Food was really about. When a company sets a purpose, they look at what societal needs are present. And then they also look at what their company, what's unique and authentic to their company that they can influence. And the other thing that we did was really dive deep on benchmarking our consumers and our customers. And what was clearly evident too was that leading up to 5-6 years ago, consumers, so everyday families in Canada, still their main concerns were food safety, health and nutrition of their food, and if it's an animal protein, animal welfare, how those animals were raised. What we noticed starting to happen right around 5-6 years ago was a shift, because prior to that, climate and environment was probably number 9 or 10 on the list of importance to consumers. And right then it started to shift, and we saw climate change and environment bump up to number 3 and then bump up to number 2 most important in consumers' mind. So that was very telling as well. And that we've seen happen right across the board. Maybe it's the media, maybe it's extreme weather events, but certainly climate change is top of mind to most. That helped us along with respect to our big environmental goals, and you mentioned those as well, Kelly. We became a carbon neutral company in 2019, the world's first major food company to do that, and we set science-based greenhouse gas targets that were approved by this global consortium of very credible organizations called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And those are likely the most ambitious set of climate standards available. And now we're seeing many other companies also commit in the food space, in the food system, and globally towards science-based targets over the last number of years. We were actually a little shocked when we submitted and got our targets approved. And I know we're going to talk more about greenhouse gas emissions, but we were only one of 3 Canadian companies to do that back in 2017. that was a little surprising to us. We thought Canadian companies en masse were much more ambitious. And we were the only food company to set science-based targets. Now I believe there's well over 20 companies in Canada that have set science-based targets, which is really good to hear. And that was a driver of our CEO as well, to write an open letter to challenge Canadian CEOs to make and take more meaningful action on climate. So lots to unpack on our sustainability journey. Seb's probably going to tell a similar story around their journey. We, as a food manufacturer and brand owner, are getting pushed on ESG by a number of different directions, both up and down. But happy to address any of those questions in the Q&A and share a little bit of experience. So I think I'm on time, Kelly. You're going to have to tell me, but I'll pass it back to you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tim. That's some really, really interesting food for thought for everyone to think about over the next few minutes. Lots going on at Maple Leaf Foods in regards to sustainability. We're going to dive into some questions about how that might impact farmers as well in a little bit. But next, we're going to hear from Sav Bellissimo. Sav is the store brand manager with Federated Co-op. Federated Co-op, very well known to many of us, the largest non-financial cooperative in Canada, which owns 170 autonomous retail cooperatives across Western Canada. And Sav's been in the consumer packaged goods industry for 30 years, focusing on product and brand development. He's a graduate from the University of Guelph, and he focuses a lot on emerging trends, and he's passionate about local producers and the importance of establishing closer ties with products on the shelf and the farmers who grow the ingredients. So Sav, welcome, and the screen is yours. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, Susie. Tim, great job. Good to see you. Just great conversations this morning. When we've been going through these conversations for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, when we really started looking at sustainability and how do we incorporate sustainability into our strategy and into our practice. Lots of dialogue, and then this year, bang, we really done a lot in the past year, especially on the fuel side. And we kind of look at this as a farm to tank strategy and then a farm to fork kind of strategy. So we made some goals this year, which we've never had before. So reducing greenhouse emissions by 40% by 2030 and having net zero emissions by 2050. And being a fuel company and running a refinery, that's, really lofty goals there. But we really think plant-based is the solution to a lot of this. So, we started this year by introducing our carbon capture program, and that's the transition to a low carbon economy. We're building a renewable diesel plant just outside of in Regina. And then we partnered with AGT on the canola crushing facility to supply that renewable diesel plant. So those were all happened over starting in October, and we just made that other announcement about a week ago on the canola crushing facility. So looking at solutions, plant-based solutions, sustainable solutions, all with agriculture in mind and Western Canada in mind. So looking at local suppliers for all of that. On the food side, which I spend most of my time on, we're looking at from plastic reduction. Is there an opportunity to reduce plastic? We joined the Canadian Plastic Pact, and we haven't set any specific goals, but we think that's going to be a big industry opportunity, and that's why we joined the Canadian Plastic Pact, to look at those opportunities and what our options are. We think in the future there is byproduct opportunities in Western Canada from a farming perspective around straws to produce product. We know we can produce it. We're just trying to figure out how to do it economically. So that's, very, very key. And also, we spent a lot of time localizing our value chain. How do we get more production out of Western Canada so we don't have to ship raw materials either to the States globally or to Eastern Canada and then ship final products back here. So those are all things we're doing from a value added side of things. So again, farm to tank and farm to fork, those are really, really key focus for us. Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks so much, Sav. One of the things I find interesting is both Tim and Sav talked about how sustainability is something that's been a discussion point in their organizations for quite some time now, going back 5 to 10 years. So it's been part of their conversations ongoing. And so there's been a lot of change in this space over the last decade. And we're going to have a few questions, and then we'll open up the floor for questions from everyone in attendance today. I'm going to start with a question that Tim, you touched on a little, and Sav, you touched on it as well a bit. The white paper addresses a number of opportunity areas for Canadian grains and oilseeds to respond to changing sustainability demand. And I was wondering if both of you could speak directly to which of these particular areas impacting sustainability is affecting your organization most significantly, those being consumer and market demand, public trust, ESG, environmental, social, and governance reporting requirements, investor demands, or regulation, or possibly something else. So of those, what do you see being the most significant demands? We'll start with Tim.
How do you check all those boxes? I'll just say check. We're at probably a little bit different stage in our sustainability journey than a lot of companies across Canada, just from the work that we've done and our alignment to purpose in the food system. From an investor standpoint, we're not getting a lot of pressure because we do have bold goals and are doing a lot of work. We also were able to shore up the first sustainability-linked loan in Canada back in 2019 as well. So we get basis point reductions on the financial instrument that all these banks come together to loan Maple Leaf Foods so we can invest capital in building and expanding our operations. If we hit our sustainability targets, we get reduced basis points on the interest of that big $1 billion loan. So that's incentive as well. So we don't get a lot of pressure from investors because of the work that we've done over the last decade. But that's all part of the journey, I think, that Seb can talk to as well. I think there's always pressure as well from our customers. So we're right in the middle of sustainability reporting season now, right? Where everyone's calculating their performance for the prior year, and our big customers send surveys at this time of year that brands and food manufacturers have to respond to, and they are significant. They are absolutely time consuming, and if you don't have answers to these big questions related to climate and health and safety and food safety and all these operational aspects and quality to the products you produce for your customers, you're going to score more poorly, and that's not something that our sales team and our company wants, right? Just to let you know, where some of these questions are going. I know last year, maybe it was different because it was COVID, but some of the big global CPG companies are now asking questions around diversity, inclusion, and the number of non-binary employees you have in your company. wow, like that's to the level of that these kind of sustainability surveys are getting to, let alone, you know, the greenhouse gas intensity of your products that you provide to the customer. Certainly it's top of mind to many organizations that, again, have control essentially over their supply chains, like Seb mentioned as well, farm to tank or farm to fork, like we are.
Thanks so much, Tim. Sav, do you have some comments?
Oh yeah, for sure. It depends on where our business. Obviously, on the fuel side, economics plays a very, very key role on switching. But you know, ESG definitely is probably the main driver. We are co-op, so we're member owned. So you know, we have lots of owners. So there's really no pressure from a shareholders perspective, but we do get a lot of customers letters and trying to deal with that as well, and trying to deal with the local co-ops. But we really want to be a leader in this, and we want to take a leadership position. And then how do we market that from a branding perspective? But regulatory also plays a really, really, really important key role as well in us making a lot of these decisions. On the food side, really it's trying to understand, since, you know, we especially from a private label side, we have around 2,000 SKUs and over 200 to 300 different suppliers. So trying to find out their sustainable practices, and then what options we have in packaging. Those are all going to be very, very key as well for us.
Thank you so much, Sav. There was something that both of you talked about in various ways, and you talked about sort of driving and being a leader in this space was important to both of you for various reasons, and it's positioned you in different ways because of that. So thanks for sharing that. The next question I'd like to talk about is in the white paper, and again, we've touched on it a bit. There's a discussion about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And we do know that agriculture and farmers as suppliers into the food and fuel system, the impact for organizations like yourselves falls into your scope 3 emissions. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit, and Sav, I'll have you talk about this first, is if you could speak about how your company is looking at scope 3 emissions, and how that's impacting your organization, but also how do you see that impacting the grain supply chain and farmers?
And scope 3 is, can you remind me what scope 3 is again? What is that?
So scope 3 would be the indirect emissions from your supply chain. So products coming in, your products coming in.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, and we definitely are looking from our suppliers and trying to understand, and we haven't really touched a lot on this as far as from a policy perspective, but we are thinking about it. But how sustainable, do they have the same values we do? Do they have the same sustainable goals that we do? So that's one way of looking at it. From the ag side, we do work, and we've started working with our ag team closer. And then trying to develop more products, so from an innovation standpoint and from a product development, we pivoted a bit and trying to work with the farmers directly on what they grow and what grows in Western Canada, and then develop product around that. So our old beverage is a great example of having transparency and traceability right back to a single source farmer. And he's a grown with purpose farmer. So he's, very much a sustainable farmer. And then how do we communicate that message from a marketing perspective and from a branding perspective, and then trying to find out if that really resonates with our consumers. So that's one example.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sav. Tim, could you comment on this question?
Yeah, it's super important, and it's very current, because One thing is for certain, and you know, the scientific data supports this, is that for food companies, the vast majority of our greenhouse gas emissions are in our supply chain, right? And that's basically how the food system has evolved over the last, you know, number of years in more of a linear supply chain as opposed to being more circular. 82% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions are from scope 3. So, and we don't have control over that. That's upstream of our barns and our processing facilities, and downstream of those facilities right through to the end consumer and our customer. I think a question popped up in the chat with respect to our core products. So we are vertically integrated on pork. We're also one of Canada's largest poultry processors, and one of North America's largest plant-based protein companies as well. So we're heavy into the protein space. And when you set a greenhouse gas target for the science-based targets, you really need a robust greenhouse gas inventory. And one of the advantages of doing that is that you'll be able to see hotspots of where your emissions are in your entire value chain. So for scope 1 emissions, where we directly have control over, you know, one of our largest sources of emissions is methane from the manure decomposing in the lagoons in Manitoba that is direct to atmosphere. All the natural gas that we consume to produce heat in our facilities is a big greenhouse gas emitter from scope 1 perspective. From a scope 3 perspective, what's interesting is that almost a third of our greenhouse gas emissions on supply chain overall come from the feed grains that we source from commodity markets to feed our pigs and chickens. And so when a company wants to take meaningful action, you look at these areas and say, well, geez, we could focus on trying to get our tool car fleet into electric vehicles. But if that's only, you know, 1% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions, why would we spend a lot of money doing that? Where would we have the most impact? Well, let's look at feed grains associated with that we buy to make the feed for our animals. And we've been doing that for the last couple of years and trying to understand the market, the supply shed, and in particular, how can an intervention with grain farmers improve the business of those grain farmers, the livelihoods of those grain farmers, but also equally benefit organizations that are well downstream of the farmer to source those. And the one very positive area, and I consider this a great opportunity right across Canada, is getting rewarded for carbon reductions and sequestration that grain farmers can have on farm. Now, this is an incredibly emerging space. It's being wound up with a term, probably a good marketer developed it. It's called regenerative agriculture. I'm sure everyone has heard of that. It's probably one of these most talked about terms globally right now. And that is trying to shift away from these mainstream practices right now to more regenerative practices, no-till, cover crops, crop rotation, grazing livestock, some of these classic techniques that, you know, probably was what farming was like 100 years ago, but we've moved away from that. So we're doing pilot projects and trying to determine how farmers can be rewarded and carbon reductions and removals can be measured on farm, where, being in Canada, there's a price on carbon. How can we, as a buyer, incentivize the supply chain to move in this direction by paying the farmers a price on carbon that can be reduced or removed on farm? That's a really interesting concept, because then farmers' fields become a carbon asset, right? And a revenue generating source. And there's lots of complicated questions I'm sure that will arise, but right now the world is working on accounting standards to measure, track, and report on land use conversions and adoption of regenerative agriculture, which we're a part of with a really positive partnership with Nutrien here in Western Canada right now.
Thank you so much, Tim and Sav. We're going to have one more question, but in the meantime, and we'll make this next question short, but in the meantime, if you have any questions, there's a few things going on in chat, but also feel free to raise your hand. We'll get to you right away. So the last question I'd like to cover is, and we'll start with you, Tim, is talking about information sharing and communication. And what role does sharing information and having strong partnerships through the supply chain have in better positioning the food system to address sustainability forces domestically and globally? And how do you see working with farmers to better communicate that to meet even your sustainability goals?
Yeah, I think that's an important part. And I know there's been a lot of work to date, obviously through Susie and the roundtable in developing the standards, and as well the emissions factors associated with that, right? So as all these consumer brands and food companies start to make science-based targets, we need a consistent, measurable, reliable way to report and track data and our performance. And as you roll up to an organization like Science-Based Targets organization, all the standards like the greenhouse gas protocol and others that are accepted globally become very important for every country and every industry group to start to follow. And those emissions factors are super important for any brand or any food company that starts on this on the carbon journey, to align to and develop metrics and reporting and the indexes. Very early on, a few years ago, many of you may have been involved with the National Index in Canada for Agri-Food that's being led by David McGuinness. And that's super important. As a sector, we need to ensure that the base framework of data and performance are aligned to where the world is moving, so that Canada can be compared in an apples to apples way against other countries and regions that are producing commodity crops and meat protein and plant protein, so that we can make that comparison and say, guess what? Canada as a food system is less impactful than the rest of the world. And that's good, not only for economic reasons for all of us, but as well, it rolls up to public trust, right? It rolls right up to what Canada can deliver to the world, what brands associated with the Canadian supply chain can deliver to the world, and really that collaboration that we can do right from farmer right up to the brand owners is super, super important.
Thanks, Tim. Sav, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think, this is a very important, from a marketing perspective and branding, this is a very, very important space for us, is to have that not only traceability back to our farms, but also to promote what our farmers are doing, and make them really the star of the show. And there's various, I've got about 10 to 12 different projects that I'm working on that's really going to bring that to light. And we've done that in the past, but we really, really want to take that to the next level. We think it's an important message, especially farms that are farming sustainable, which is a lot of our farms, is how do we tell that story to our consumers and drive that message. As far as metrics go, and we think it's important to localize our value chain, and that really is a way, but we haven't really had a way of measuring that from gas emissions or from a sustainability. So those are areas we definitely want to look at, that we think is very, very important, and how do we capture that and then share that information.
Thank you very much, Sav. At the moment, we don't have any hands raised, but we do have a question in the chat. Susie, can you, from Maxime, I am not bilingual, so I can't translate that, but Susie or one of our interpreters, maybe you could just go over the question for us.
This was actually more related to the previous discussion, but I think that it really has some relevance to the situation or to the two speakers, which is how would you consider or how could you share with the producers the monetary advantage that comes from a code of practice that let me put it this way. Let me rephrase it. So if a code of practice leads to an increase in the confidence of your products with consumers, how would you share the monetary advantage that comes with that increase in confidence?
I'll let you go, Tim.
Okay, I'll have to think more deeply about that, but just right off the bat, as I was trying to describe, one economic advantage, if the code of practice is going to make farmers more efficient, if the code of practice is potentially going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there are regulated and voluntary carbon markets now that farmers can participate in. Part of our approach as well, as I mentioned earlier, as being a carbon neutral company, as a carbon neutral company, we are reliant right now on purchasing offsets to neutralize our greenhouse gas emissions that we can't avoid right now. There are a lot of greenhouse gas emissions we can't avoid in our scope 1 and 2 and portions of our scope 3 emissions. I mentioned like cars and trucks right now. Like there's not enough electric infrastructure to move all the way to electric vehicles. There's not enough renewable natural gas in the Canadian market right now for Maple Leaf to source to neutralize our consumption in our plants. So we're reliant on certified carbon offsets, and I've seen an incredible amount of growth with respect to carbon offsets from agricultural sources in North America, which is really, really positive. 5 years ago, there were very, very few, less than 1% of ag offsets on the voluntary market. Moving upwards now, it's still really low, but it's probably under 4%. We need that to rise because agriculture offsets are incredibly meaningful. Most will sequester carbon as opposed to just reduce it. And if farmers can participate in those markets, definitely there's an economic benefit.
Tim, thank you. Sav?
Yeah, it's a difficult questions because it's for us. It's you know, we're investing a lot in trying to become more sustainable. I think demand for plant-based products is going to rise, added value products, and you know, so I definitely see agriculture as part of the solution long term. And I just think as demand increases, you know, prices, the market's going to go up, and prices will drive up. And we've seen some of that already with commodity prices. But.
Thank you very much, Sav. Glenn made a comment in the chat about greenhouse gas inventory, just sort of leading up a bit on some of the comments you had made earlier, Tim. So I think there's a question there, but if anybody wants to just see Glenn's chat post, thanks for sharing that, Glenn. And Matt has
Sorry,
made a
Kelly, I was just kind of scanning Glenn's question there and brought up the term greenwashing. And that's really important for consumer brands and our industry, right? Like we can't just go out there and say, well, we haven't told our story as best we could over the years. Let's just get it all out there and then lay claim to this, that, and the other thing and say, are we great and sustainable? That's a real risk to brand owners, corporates like Maple Leaf and the entire supply chain, because it would impact public trust. And so, you know, how we deal with it is just abiding to a very straightforward approach, and that transparency builds trust, right? So you could go to Maple Leaf Foods' website. You see all our carbon inventory, our GHG inventory, as much information we can put on there, and it's all fact-based, right? As well, as a carbon neutral company, you can go through our website and click on these offset registries and see the tonnage of emissions that we retire on these public registries, right down to the last metric ton. So that's super important when you're a brand or you're a significant part of the supply chain, to anchor your claims and your programs in data and in science. That's going to be the probably the most effective way that our food system can avoid greenwashing. And sometimes technology and science lags a little bit for what the marketers want to do. So they might lean into risk or wait for that to happen. And certainly, you know, my personal perspective is that you're not going to see big supply chain claims around regenerative agriculture, certainly from our organization, until we actually have an accounting standard to be able to measure it. And as well, we get third parties to look at it, and our auditors to validate, and certification that goes with that. So all these kinds of things help us reduce that risk of greenwashing.
Yeah, good point, Tim. And I think you know, you got to be authentic in your claims.
Yes, absolutely.
That's very, very important. And that's some of the stuff why we haven't made, you know, from plastic reduction or from, you know, from the consumer side, made any goals or objectives, because we are very, very careful, because there's a lot of people making a lot of companies making some huge claims and or objectives, and then no one ever calls them out because they're just so far out. So we have to be very careful on that. We have to be authentic, and we have to be real. And the only way of doing that is understanding where you are today, and that's really the hard part. And then how do we communicate that message, because it is a very complex issue as well.
Thanks so much. Susie, anything else in the chat before we wrap up?
No, I think we can go ahead. Oh, there is a comment from Matt. It says 45% of the arable land is in Saskatchewan, and doesn't know anybody who's received money for carbon sequestration.
Well, it's coming. We're working with farmers in Saskatchewan with our Nutrien pilot project. We're trying to scale to 100,000 acres between Manitoba and Saskatchewan. I know Nutrien also has probably an equal or more number of acres. And our pilot project's based on the Alberta Conservation Cropping Protocol that is sunsetted now in Alberta, and bringing that rigor to Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And as well, it was mentioned earlier, the for our nitrogen program, also a very, very robust framework and standard that can be applied that can help sequester carbon.
Thank you for viewing our panel session. Should you have any comments or questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. You may also want to view our metrics platform, which provides information on the sustainability performance of Canadian cereals, oilseeds, and special crops. You can find the metrics platform at metrics.sustainablecrops.ca.